Our speaker right now is Richard Wolff. He is a extremely important piece of modern radical economic theory, described by quite a few people, much more impressive than myself, like Cornel West, who says he's the leading socialist economist in the country, which is no exaggeration. He's currently he's a professor emeritus of economics at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, currently a visiting professor at the New School in New York, has done incredibly useful work in the modern era on thinking through what Marxism means, and started around 1988 with the journal Rethinking Marxism and the circles around that project, to really, as the sort of long historical experiment of state socialism was coming to a close, really thinking through the problems about class and surplus value that were still very much on the table and very much needed to be thought through. So tremendous amounts of important work there. And then in recent years, as capitalism has started to fall apart in all sorts of destructive but also potentially very interesting ways that open up these spaces for possibility to think through alternatives to this economic system, he's really gone on the offensive, which is really pretty amazing. So you may hear him on WBAI, on his weekly radio show, Economic Update. You may have seen his incredibly important series of commentaries that were gathered together in the book Capitalism Hits the Fan, that blow by blow tracked with very radical perspective the economic crisis and the response as it unfolded. He's just published a book with, earlier this summer, or just over the summer, a collection of interviews with David Barsamian called Occupy the Economy. And today he's here to present a book which just launched, just came back from the printers this week. It's called Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. So please join me in welcoming Richard Wolff.
Thank you very much. I will try very hard to justify such a generous introduction. I'm going to organize what I have to say into the bad news and then the good news, because I don't want you to leave depressed. So I'm going to do what the book does. I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about the economic crisis that we're in and why it has lasted so long and why there is no end in sight. And then I'm going to try to explain why the policies used by the United States government have been so stunningly unsuccessful from day one, as they are today right now. And then, just to provoke you, I'm going to try to offer you an alternative solution that I think would do a better job. So it's a big agenda. I'm going to try to do all of that in about a half an hour so that there's time for us to talk. And partly I'm trying to tease you here in the hopes that you will get the book where these arguments are made in greater detail. So let me start with the bad news, but as I often do, by beginning to ask you to please remember, I'm just the messenger. I am not the cause of what I'm about to describe to you. I'm just here to tell it the way it is. If you would rather not hear it the way it is, then I would urge you to go back and listen to the political leaders we have or the media personalities, because they will present it to you with a much softer, more uplifting, hopeful tone. But I assume you didn't come here for that. All right, let's begin. We are now ending year 5 of this crisis. It begins in December of 2007. 5 years. Unemployment in the United States when the crisis began, something on the order of 7 million people, according to the government. It then went up to about 15 million people, from 5 to roughly 10%, and now it's 8.5%, which means it hasn't even come halfway back to where it was when this crisis started. So any talk of an economic recovery with those numbers is to be dismissed as what it is, which is junk, and not to be taken seriously. We have a crisis that has resisted almost every effort to deal with it. And just so we're all on the same page, what is an economic crisis? It's a time when the irrationality of capitalism is shown in the most glaring way. So let's use today's numbers. The Bureau of Labor Statistics in Washington keeps a number called U-6. It's one of the several unemployment numbers that they have. And it adds together the people who have no work but are looking, the people who have quit looking because they've given up hope, and third, the people who have a part-time job but want a full-time job. You put those three together, and we're talking about an unemployment rate now of around 15 or 16%. 20 to 25 million people in that situation. So just keep that in your mind for a minute. Statistic number two, and I promise not to throw a lot of statistics at you, but statistic number two comes from the Federal Reserve, the banking center of the United States. They keep a number called capacity utilization. What portion of the tools, equipment, raw materials, factory, office, store space is being used, and what is just sitting there, idle, gathering rust and dust? And the number the Federal Reserve has been giving out for several years now is about 20%. Okay, let's do that then. 20 to 25 million people who want to work. All the tools, equipment, and raw materials we could imagine for them to work with and on. And if we put the people who want to work together with all the equipment that's just sitting there rotting, we could produce an output that would transform the American economy, solve our social problems, rebuild our cities, help our neighbors. Wow, what we could do. An economic system that cannot put together 20 to 25 million people who want to work with all of the equipment and raw materials they need to work with to produce the output we all know we need is an economic system whose time has come and gone. You don't need a sophisticated argument. A capitalism is unable to solve this problem. Because in a capitalist system, you will only put people to work with all the equipment to produce all that output if it is privately profitable for someone to do that. Even though the society can see in a minute that we need that done, that everybody would be better off if it were done, we are held hostage to a system that depends on capitalists making money. If they don't, they won't. And if they don't, you don't have the economic system that you want. Well, if that's true about a crisis, do we have it often? Yeah, we do. Crises are a little bit like other disasters. As soon as they're over, people like to forget that they happened in the hopes that maybe by magic then they won't happen again. This is the second major breakdown of this capitalist system in 75 years. The last one was in the 1930s. It was even worse in the 1930s than it is so far. We don't know. The one in the 1930s started in 1929, ended in 1941. That's 12 years. We're just in year 5. So we'll see how bad it gets and how long it lasts. But what you may not know is that between the end of the Great Depression in the 1930s and the one that we're in now that started in 2007, there were 11 other economic downturns, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research, which is the agency that does that, counts them. In other words, we have an economic system that is stupefyingly unstable. And some of you have heard me tell this story. I'll tell it one more time. I used to like to lean across the podium in my classes and say to my students, if you lived with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. Or you would have demanded that your roommate get professional help. But you live in an economic system that is at least as unstable, and you imagine that you have no options and you have no choices. Strange. An economic system that plunges people into unemployment, lost output, colossal waste regularly. Every president of the United States, since Roosevelt in the 30s, has made the following statement, because every president has presided over an economic downturn. That's how often they happen. Every president has said, if you just follow my policies, not only will we get out of this current recession, depression, whatever, but, and then there's a pregnant pause, we will make sure, if you follow my policies, that our children will not have to go through a crisis like this again. Every president has promised that, and no president has yet delivered on that promise. We keep having them, and we have them now. Every effort of the economics profession, of which I am a part, to prevent these crises, these colossal wastes of resources, these colossal experiences in which millions of people lose their job, lose their home in many cases, suffer the damage to their self-esteem, their sense of worth, their productivity. The costs are catastrophic. We have a system that keeps doing that to millions of people and cannot prevent it. Has never been able to prevent it. Do you need more arguments that a system ought to be questioned? A system ought to be changed that works like this? Well, let me give you a couple. This is a system that keeps producing inequality in our society. For the last 30 to 40 years, we have had a divide. 40 years ago, the United States had a greater degree of equality between rich and poor than in most other European countries. Today, the relationship is reversed. We are the most unequal. There's a reason why Occupy Wall Street came up with that brilliant slogan, 1%, 99%. That's a good summary of what the last 30 years have done. Well, you might say, at least it was just the last 30 years. Wasn't it more equal before that? Yes, it was. But how did it come to be more equal before that? So that we could now have this bad story. The answer was the last time capitalism collapsed, the 1930s. Just to remind those of you that aren't familiar, in 1933, the unemployment rate in this country was 25%. That's 3 times what it is today. Things were really desperate in the 30s. But there was a difference. The mass of people in the 1930s in this country didn't take it lying down. They didn't wait. They didn't wonder. They acted in a remarkable way. And because my time is limited, I'm now going to condense that story for you really tightly. 3 organizations organized quickly in the 1930s with the Great Depression. The first was the CIO, Congress of Industrial Organizations. They organized Americans into unions on a scale never before in American history and never since. In a matter of months, tens of millions of Americans who had never been in a union before joined it. And the other organizations working together with the CIO, socialist parties, more than one, and the American Communist Party. They were strong, they were big, they were growing, and they worked closely with the CIO. Wow. A big, powerful set of coordinated organizations. And they went to the president, Franklin Roosevelt, and they said to him, "Dear Mr. President, we would like to make a point, actually 2 points. Here's point number 1. We represent the American people, at least those able and willing to act in an organized way, and we are very angry. And we demand you do something for the millions who are suffering unemployment, losing their homes through foreclosure, the whole bit. And amongst us, there are some, you know, those socialists and communists over there, they want to go even further. They don't just want you to help us, they want to change the system. So here we're going to make you a deal, Mr. President. Stop what you're doing. Stop all this bailing out of banks. Sound familiar? Stop all this helping the big corporations. Stop all this shoring up the stock market. Help the people at the bottom. And if you don't, ... Mr. Roosevelt was a good politician. He understood. He went to his friends, the rich and the corporate leaders of America, from whom he, after all, came in his family. And he said to them, you see all those demonstrations in the streets? Hear what they came and told me. And he repeated the story. So he said, I got an idea, and here's what it is. You're going to have to give me, you rich people and you corporate, you're going to have to give me a lot of money. And I'm going to use the money to help the mass of people. You can, of course, decide not to do it, in which case those socialists and communists coming down the road are going to take from you everything you have, and you'll not be in a position to give or not give because you won't have it anymore. Have a nice day. Half of the business and the rich in America went with the president. They went for the deal. The other half never did. That's the core of the Republican Party now. But half went with him. And so Roosevelt went back to the unions and the socialists and the communists. He said, okay, I got a deal. I'm going to help the mass of the people But in return, you got to stop talking about socialism and communism so much. And you can write about it in your little newspapers, no one cares. But stop talking about it all the time. Just talk about how wonderful it would be if the president and the government helped the mass of people. The deal was done. The socialists and the communists kept talking about it, but not so much. And the big corporations and the rich people paid. Oh boy, did they pay. And so Roosevelt could go on the radio in the 30s and say, let me remind you now, before I tell you, the depths of a depression, nobody working, every city, every state, the whole federal government, no taxes coming in because everybody was unemployed. They had nothing, much worse than today. In the middle of a situation where everybody's unemployed, nobody has any money, and the government can't provide any services, what did Roosevelt do? He announced first, I'm going to create, with a big smile, I'm going to create the Social Security system. I'm going to give everybody who's 65 years of age or older a check every month for the rest of their life. Have a nice day. No sooner was the ink dry on that, a stupefyingly expensive program, where was the money going to come from? He announced the unemployment compensation system in America. We never had that either, just like we never had a Social Security system before. If you're unemployed, and let me remind you, tens of millions were then, you're going to get a check every week for a year or two to help you. We're going to help you that are unemployed, and we're going to be helping your elderly parents so they're not such a burden on you when you can least afford it. And no sooner did he finish with that than he came with the really good one. He went on the radio and he said, if the private capitalist sector of America can't provide jobs to the tens of millions of Americans who want them, then there is obviously, notice the word, obviously, no alternative but for me to do it. And between 1934 and 1941, Roosevelt created and filled 12.5 million jobs. And what paid for the Social Security? And what paid for the unemployment compensation? And what paid for those jobs? Corporations and the rich. Roosevelt and the people then knew where the money was. They just had to go get it. You all know where the money is now. But there are no comparable institutions yet to go get it. Last point, just to make sure you all know the numbers. What was the income tax rate that Roosevelt levied on the richest Americans once this deal was worked out? 94%. Let me make that clear to you. If you were in the top bracket, every dollar, roughly over $25,000, which was the high income then, every dollar that was earned over $25,000, you gave Uncle Sam 94 cents, you got to keep 6 cents. What is the comparable top rate today? 35%. Let me do that again. 94%, 35%. That's a tax cut. Nothing like that has been seen by the working or middle classes of America ever. Nothing close. But they were taxed then. In 1944, for every dollar Washington got in taxing individuals, it got $1.50, 50% more, $1.50 from taxing corporations. What's the relationship today? For every dollar the federal government taxes people in this country, here's what it gets from corporations, 25 cents. You understand? Over the last 50 years, we've undone what was done then. We taxed the rich and corporations then. We don't tax them anymore. By taxing the rich and corporations and helping everybody else, America became a more egalitarian society. It helped to create and sustain the middle class. But what has happened since, once the Depression was over and once the war was over, the deal was over too. And the business community went and took back, step by step, recreating the inequality, recreating the 99 and 1% difference. Now let's get to the message of this, which is the point of the book. What happened here? What's the lesson we're going to get? Here's the lesson. When capitalism breaks down, like it did in the 30s, and like it is doing now, you kind of have two choices. Choice number one is what was done in the 30s. You demand help for the mass of people. And you know something? If you organize well and you're not held back by anti-communism, anti-socialism, anti-unionism. You can get that. How do we know that? We did. That's what we did in the 1930s. But there's another lesson. If that's all you do, if you get the government to help out the mass of people, but you leave in place the corporate leaders who run America's business, if you let corporations continue to be owned by the major shareholders, usually 10 or 20 people own, institutionally or individually, the block of shares in most corporations. If you leave them in place and you allow them to continue to select boards of directors, you're leaving in place the decision makers of our economic system. You're leaving in place the executives at the board of directors who are the ones who decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. They have every incentive to undo the taxes that fall on them that Roosevelt agreed to. They have every incentive to get rid of the regulations that limit how much profit they can earn. But not only do they have the incentive to undo all of that, but they have the resources because into their hands flow the profits. So they have the resources to do what they have every incentive to do. And what the last 30, 40 years shows, they will do. So here's the lesson. If you're not going to have more crises, more inequality, more breakdowns, then you have to do much more than get the government to step in and help people when they're really down. You have to change the organization of enterprises. And that's what I want to talk to you about because I think that's the good news. That is the solution. And let me explain to you how it would work and why it would be the solution. First, how it would work, that shouldn't come as a difficulty to you because it already exists all over the world and has existed in America for all our history. It has other names, co-ops, cooperative businesses, collective enterprises, community enterprises, lots of words. It's when working people get together and own and operate their own businesses. It's when we become our own board of directors. We become our own leaders. Monday to Thursday, we come to work, we do whatever the particular task is. Friday, we come to work, and instead of doing our particular task, we sit around for half the day or all day having meetings and making the decisions what to produce, where to produce, how to produce, and what to do with the profits. We function as our own board of directors. How hard is it? Wow, what an interesting idea. Let me express it again in language that Americans will more likely think reasonable. An enterprise is where most Americans spend most of their lives as adults. 5 out of 7 days, 8 to 5. You know, it's your life. It's where you spend most of your life. If you actually believe in democracy, where would it be more appropriate to institutionalize it than where you spend most of your life? Where you work. And what does the concept of democracy mean? If you're affected by a decision, you ought to have the right to participate in making it. Not a big, complex idea. We've organized our politics like that. We think we ought to have a right to vote and to participate in choosing our political leaders. But the truth of it is, we care much less about them than about the economic leadership in the places where we work that impact our lives every single day in the most fundamental way. So if we believe in democracy, why the hell haven't we democratized our enterprises, made them run by the people who work there? Oh, I know some of you say, gee, the average worker isn't prepared, doesn't know the technical question. Stop. You know what was said by Europeans when monarchy began to collapse in the face of the demand for democracy? It was said, we have to have a king or an emperor or a czar or a kaiser or some dictator or another, because, you know, we are just the people. What do we know? We wouldn't be able to make these, we mustn't, we shouldn't. We blew all that away in politics. And just that way we can blow it away in economics. We should have long ago. Why? Well, let's see what workers would do if they ran the factories, the stores, and the offices themselves. Let's just give you a few examples. One, let's see. Do you think the workers, if they ran an enterprise, would make a decision like the following? Let's close the enterprise here in Baltimore and open up another one in Shanghai. Less likely. You wouldn't want to do away with your own job and your family's income and your neighborhood survival. You wouldn't do it, would you? What an interesting idea. Here's another example. Suppose you were sitting down as the workers deciding what to do with the profits that, after all, your labor helped to produce. Would you give a tiny portion of your workers, you the people who work, would you give a tiny number of them huge salaries, 10, 20, 30 million dollars of bonuses and stock options, while the rest of you were having trouble paying for your child's daycare center? I don't think so. You know what I would guess? You probably wouldn't do that. You'd be much more equal. You'd give some more than others, perhaps, for all kinds of reasons, but you wouldn't give some people obscene take-home pay with everybody. You wouldn't do that, would you? Here's a thought. If the workers distributed the profits, it would be the best and the fastest way to begin to do something about the inequality of income in this country that we all talk about, and we keep wondering why nothing gets done. Here's a way to get it done. Here's another example. Suppose a decision where you work has to do with technology, a new kind of machine, a new kind of cleaner for the bathroom. And that decision is made by a board of directors far away. And suppose they were comparing how profitable it would be to use this new chemical. And they realized it would be quite profitable. But it turns out it's not good to breathe that chemical. It's not so good for children and people with emphysema and lung problem. Well, you know what the board of directors is going to do. If it makes more money, but suppose a decision is made by the workers there, the ones who have to breathe that, or drink it, or touch it, and take it home and touch their children with it inadvertently. They're not going to do it. They're going to have a different way of calculating what pays and what doesn't, what should be done and what doesn't. In short, if the workers did it themselves, we would have a completely different society and a different history. We would actually have brought economic democracy into the world. And we would have done it here at the center, allowing people all over the rest of the world to follow suit. What a remarkable idea. What an idea whose time has come, not just because it's democracy which we're supposed to believe in, but also because it is the only solution available to us that will not either leave us in this crisis for an indefinite period of time or get us out of it only to plunge right back into it, which has been the problem with every other solution. Here's something else to think about, and let me close with this. Notice in all that I have said, you don't need a big role for the government. We're not talking about the older styles of socialism and communism. There's nothing in my story about having a big government make all these, not at all. This is in fact a bottom-up solution. It talks about how workers themselves are going to become the drivers of their enterprises. It means, for example, that we will change our society, and I'll just give you one provocative example. In terms of our education system, we're not going to educate a tiny number of people to be the directors anymore, because we're all going to do that. We're all going to have two job descriptions: the particular task we do and our participation in the directing, designing, and leadership of our enterprises. So we'll all, for the first time, have to have education that prepares us for both of our social roles. Let me use myself as an example. I'm the child of immigrants. I was born in the United States, but my father is French and my mother's German. So I didn't speak English until I was dropped into kindergarten. But I was born in a very special part of America, Youngstown, Ohio. A paragon example of the disaster of the last 50 years, if you know its history. But as the child of immigrants, I went, because of pressure from my parents who had to realize through me their shattered hopes and dreams as refugees. So I went to school and worked very hard because I couldn't bear displeasing my parents, who would have cried if I hadn't come home with the A and all the rest. So here I am, immigrant kid. I went to Harvard. And I remember my first day. It was orientation, a week before the school starts. And we were all set in a place called Memorial Hall, big building in Cambridge. And the president of Harvard welcomed us as freshmen. And he said, look at the man on your left, look at the man on your right. These were the days in ancient history when there were no women in the room. They were at a place called Radcliffe, which is a few blocks away. The man on your left is going to be a senator. And the man on your right is going to be a captain of industry. And then there was a pregnant pause, and he looked at all of us and he said, I want you to understand, you're at Harvard. You are going to run the world. That was what the man said to us. Now, you know, a freshman already has a fairly large head. At that moment, everybody's head got 4 times larger because we were being flattered by this nonsense from a man who believed it, because he was the president of all of this. Okay? Well, if you go to the East St. Louis Community College, you don't get a speech like that. You probably don't even have an orientation session, and if you do, they explain to you where the bathroom is and where you can park your car. But not that you're going to run the world. All of that has to change now because we're going to democratize enterprise. And that means we're going to make a job and a workplace something for you that it has never been before. A place you look forward to. A place where you can explore your capabilities, where you can be as large-minded and as interested in changing the way things are produced and what's produced. You know, work doesn't have to be just the way you get the money that will enable you to go to the mall. Work doesn't have to be the kind of place which, when it's over in the afternoon, on your way home, you pass a place that says, come here and you can have a happy hour. Because the message there is, the rest of your hours before you got here are the other kind of hour. Well, it's very important because that's where you spend most of your life, to transform the work experience, to make it a chance for you to grow and develop and show all of your capabilities, is indeed doing something that goes beyond overcoming the failures of capitalism and really offers us a new way to think about what we're doing. Last point. You know, the labor movement in this country has been on a 50-year decline. It's a straight line down. And the labor movement knows somewhere, even in its worst moments, that it can never come back unless it once again becomes what it once was, which is something that's not only wanting to help workers, but wants to be a social movement, change society, get the mass of people excited again because they see a new way of living for themselves, for their children. What better way to do that than to have the labor movement embrace as a second part of its strategy not only the old collective bargaining where you go and get a better wage or a better benefit for your workers. Keep doing that, that's fine. But have a second part of your strategy, which is we're also going to set up and finance and build workers' self-directed enterprises. Wow. We're going to go to an employer and say, we want better wages and working conditions. But you know something, Mr. Employer? If you say no, we got another option. You don't have to. In which case, we're going to take all the workers from you and all the machines, and we're going to set up an enterprise. And you want to threaten us by saying you'll go to China? You go. We'll take the workers that remain, we'll set them up here, and we'll go to the American people and say, well, you can buy the cheaper thing from China, or you can be disloyal that way, or you can help fellow Americans by buying this stuff, which was made here by people like you. And when you risk losing your job, those people will save you the way you're being asked to say, whoa, think a minute. And for those of you that may still be skeptical, gee, can it work? Gee, can it work for anything larger than a little place? I don't know, a Red Emma's or a Arizmendi Bakery, for those of you who know the little groups in San Francisco, a little group of bakery. Well, I got news for you. Do co-ops start small? Usually. And you know, when in that way, they resemble capitalism. If you ever study the history of capitalism and how it arose out of feudalism in Europe, you know how capitalists started? They all started small. One capitalist, 3 workers. One capitalist, 6 workers. They developed to be big later. So starting small is not a mark against an economic system. It's how most economic systems develop. So of course, co-ops and workers' collectives start small. Can they become large? You bet. Last point for today. In 1956, in the north of Spain, in an area called the Basque country, because the people there have their own language and their own culture, the Basque language and culture, a Catholic priest, Father Arizmendi, was worried about his flock because they were all unemployed. Spain had had a terrible civil war, and then the World War II, and the Depression. They were in trouble. So Father Arizmendi said, okay, there's nobody, no capitalist around who's going to hire anybody, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to start workers' enterprises where the workers employ themselves, workers' self-directed enterprises. He started with 6 people, 6 men in northern Spain. And they started in a little city called Mondragon. That's the Spanish name. Arrasate is the Basque name, because in that part of Spain, every village and town has 2 names, the Basque and the Spanish. They started a workers' self-owned, self-managed. The government didn't bother them for 2 reasons. The Basques have a long history of fighting for their independence, and they take to arms. The Spanish government did not want to have to fight with them. The second reason nobody bothered them was they were led by a Catholic priest, which kind of half put the Catholic Church on the side of this project. Okay, now fast forward. Today, is the Mondragon system still there? Yeah. It's now called the Mondragon Corporation. It doesn't anymore have 6 workers. It has 120,000 workers. It is the 7th biggest corporation in Spain, and it is the largest single corporation in the north of the country. That's right. There are no shareholders. There is no board of directors. It is a collection of 200 or 300 co-ops, in every one of which the workers make the decisions. The workers hire the managers and the executives, not the other way around. Here are some rules. No one in Mondragon can be paid more than a maximum of 6.5 times what the lowest one gets. In our country today, the gap is several hundred. So can it become big and successful? You betcha. Spain today has an unemployment rate of 25%. What is the unemployment rate in the Basque region? 11%. Do they suffer from the world economy turn down? Of course they do. But they have managed to protect their people in a way no capitalist in Spain has been able to do. Let me end with an appeal. It's only a matter of us now. Capitalism is weaker than it has been. I have been giving speeches like this, which I don't hold too many punches back. You can test me by asking some questions. I'll do it even further. I've done more public speaking in the last 18 months than I did in the previous 40 years. I'm on the radio and television every day. You can say and fight for these things now in the United States in a way that hasn't been true before in my lifetime. And look at my gray hair. It used to be that the left in America would have to say, gee, it's hard to work here. There isn't an opening. People aren't sympathetic. They won't listen. That's over. Now it's a question, because the openness is there. Now it's a question of whether the left can rise to the occasion, say what it has to say, go out there, because the interest and the sympathy is there. Capitalism is not delivering the goods to the American people. It delivers one piece of bad news after another. The space is there, the time is now, and the idea of workers taking over their own lives, bringing democracy finally to the economy and the enterprise, is a powerful way to mobilize the feelings that are already there. Thank you very much for your attention.
So we have some time for some questions, and I want to ask people, just because we are outside, at any moment a band may start up or whatever, it's going to be great if you kind of come up and let me give you the microphone to ask your question. We don't have that much time, so I'd ask you to keep the comments brief so we can get as many voices as possible. And I saw a hand here and back there, so those will be the first two.
I was just wondering if, I remember in maybe the end of the Reagan government, there were a few experiences of companies that were being run by their employees. I think some rental car companies and some airline companies. I was wondering if that is a good example, and what else is really happening in this country, and which are the unions that are maybe have the chance to help organize that.
Okay, quickly, the question was about some examples of this in the recent past. Yes, the Avis Rent-A-Car for a while was owned by its employees, and United Airlines likewise. But you have to keep carefully separate in your mind what it means for an airline to be owned by its worker as opposed to what it means for an airline to be directed by the workers. Often workers can directly or more likely through their pension plans buy shares in a company, and they can become the majority owners. But when that has happened, and that's called ESOP, E-S-O-P, Employee Stock Ownership Program, and they're known as ESOP corporations, and they exist in the United States, as they do in other countries. But what has typically happened is when workers become owners, they think that the way you have to run an enterprise is the way it was run before when the owners were other people. So what they do is they hire professional members of the board of directors who end up running the company in the same way that it was run before, with the workers being kept out. And all the workers do are being told, if you want to get a dividend from your share of this thing, you better let us run this as a profit-making corporation, and so you don't get much change. You get a little bit money flowing to the workers because they own the shares, but you don't get much change in any of the dimensions I've talked about. That's why I stress worker self-directed enterprises, where the point is whether or not you own it, do you run it? Do you make the decisions that shape what happens? Second, there are many examples of this has been done. Let me give you the one that mostly blows people's minds because of the implications. For the last 30 years, in a place called Silicon Valley, the area below San Francisco running to San Jose in that part of California, between the bay and the ocean, is a center, as many of you know, for the telecommunications and computer industries. Every year there, hundreds of engineers quit their jobs. They work with places like Cisco and IBM and Apple and all those kinds of big corporations. They quit. And here's what they say. I hate my job. I hate going there in my tie and my jacket and my formal outfit. I hate being told by some asshole executive what I'm supposed to do. I'm not productive. I can't explore. I hate my job. I go there because I get a lot of money, but I hate my job. These people, in large numbers, quit every year. And here's what they do. They walk away and they collect with a few of their friends, 20, 30, 40, their little laptops, and they go to somebody's garage who has a garage, and they line up their laptops, and here's what they say. We're going to come to work in whatever we feel like. Hawaiian shirts and Bermuda shorts. We're going to come with our Frisbees and our toddler and our dog. We're going to come in various states of, how should I put this, highness. And we're going to have a wonderful time. And we're going to enjoy what we do. And we're going to love to come to work. And guess what? The statistics show they are more productive than the counterparts who stayed behind in the top-down hierarchical capitalist enterprises. And they say so themselves. We are more productive. We are freer here. You know what these people have done? They've walked away from capitalism. They've walked away from a capitalist enterprise, and they've created a non-capitalist enterprise, an enterprise run by the workers themselves. They have strict rules. We're all equal here. No boss, no underling. We work 4 days a week. That's where I got the example I gave you earlier. And on the 5th day, we get together and make all the decisions. We love our jobs. Here's the irony. When I go and speak to them, and they've asked me to come, and I explain all of this to them in the larger frame, and I end up looking across the podium and saying, you know, there is a person who kind of came up with this idea in a very interesting way a while back. You may be surprised to know who he is. Oh, who is he? Who is he? And I say, Karl Marx. And they look at me with shock, and that's when I learned that most of these people who do this are Republicans. They are. And they think of what they're doing as showing entrepreneurial initiative. And I remember the first time I heard that saying, look, it's fine with me. You want to call it a purple banana? I don't care. But this is what you're doing. You're changing the economic system. Those are very successful companies. So this is not a foreign phenomena. This is not something Americans don't take to. Conservative Americans take to it. And again, history helps us here. Did the people who broke away from feudalism, who were serfs who ran away into the woods, when they set up employer-employee relationships, did they say, hey, we're starting capitalism? They had no idea of such a word. They were making do in a new way that made sense to them, that they preferred to the feudalism that they had before. Later on, it got the name. Those people in California, they walk away from capitalism, but they need someone like me to come and say, hey, that's what you just did. It's doable. It's now a question of whether we make it happen or not.
All right, so I saw there was a couple of hands that went up. I'm going to take three at a time, just so we're going to probably only have time for those three. So let me get you and Heather. And if you want to ask your question, and then we'll let Richard respond. He's going to be signing books right after the talk right over there, so if you've got questions, we'll be happy to answer them. But let's get these three questions out on the table and give them a chance to respond.
What you just described, both the work of self-directed enterprise and Mondragon, are ideas that I'm actually sympathetic to considerably, but they would exist if I get your drift in a market framework. And my concern is that in a capitalist market framework, there is always a tendency to push down wages, and that could come actually from workers in less developed areas who simply want to capture more work. There's also, I think, a tendency for hierarchy to reappear in certain situations like that. So I'd be interested in your comments on that.
Hey, thanks a lot. I actually come from founding 3 different worker cooperatives, so I really appreciate seeing this many people have self-management advocating to them. But I'm curious, you cite Mondragon as sort of like the behemoth example of this, and simultaneously talk about the fact that when workers are owners rather than sort of running the operation, that they tend to run it the ways in which sort of capitalist-minded, top-down-minded people previously ran an enterprise. And my understanding is that now Mondragon has about 43% of its workforce is not actually directing it. They're just conventional employees, precisely because it has been run in that way. And I'm wondering what sort of critique you have of that, or how you reconcile that, or what your sort of analysis of that is.
Let's do that last question.
So I'm sold, sort of. I'm trying to get sold. Anyway, we're facing an economic crisis, but we're also facing an ecological crisis, right? So my question is, and I'm struggling with this question in my head, so hopefully you have some insight. How you're kind of touting the large level of productivity that a lot of these worker cooperatives display, but we need to really dial back our level of production for ecological purposes. So that's a paradox to me that I can't seem to wrap my mind around, because full employment requires plundering, and we are looking for full employment, right? So I don't know how to reconcile that.
Okay, let me try to be as brief and fast as I can. About the market, it's possible for workers' self-directed enterprises to exist in a market. I wouldn't particularly advocate that. I think that we've learned a lot about the limits and problems of markets. I think we've also learned about the possibilities of economic planning as it has been used in a variety of places in the world, both centralized and decentralized planning. So my guess is, like most societies in the world, if you actually study them, they are mixtures of markets and planning, not polarized either or the way in ideology this game gets played out. And my guess would be that in a workers' self-directed enterprise type of economy, there'd be a mixture of markets and planning according to what the people in those enterprises wanted, and I think that would be a reasonable way to expect it to go. And part of the reason you would never rely exclusively on the market is precisely because of some of the negative qualities that markets have always displayed. And since I'm a professor of economics, allow me a moment. When I teach a course on the history of economic thought, which I often do, I require my students to begin by reading a little bit of Plato and Aristotle. And the reason I do that is way back then, thousands of years ago in Athens, both Plato and Aristotle railed against the horror of markets. Here we are, we love to celebrate our descendants from the great Greek philosophers from whom Western civilization derives, but the two leading proponents were harsh critics of markets. So the notion that the market is a magical instrument is a very modern idea. Most of the history of the human race hasn't believed anything like that, and believe me, they weren't all stupid and backward, so that we're now the modern vanguard in this area. We may have gone in a direction that they already figured out made little sense. Second thing, Mondragon. Let's give the exact numbers. Mondragon today has about 120,000 people who in one sense or another work in it. Roughly 85,000 of those are what are called worker members. But the questioner is right that the other, depending on how you count, 30,000, roughly number, 35,000, are employees. And most of those employees for Mondragon are actually outside Spain. They're not in Spain because Mondragon has been setting up enterprises all over the world, including in the United States, half a dozen in this country, but they have many in China, in India. And they talk a great deal inside of Mondragon about the problem that we have a majority of people who are workers and members and make all the decisions, but there's another group that are employees. Now, it's unusual because the 30,000 are employees of the 85,000. It's not your normal situation. They claim that they want to bring in the other 35,000 so that they are full members. But they have made a concession. And the irony is the concession, they say, was forced on them. And they give the example of China, where they tried very hard with the Chinese workers to set it up as a co-op. The Chinese workers, they said to us, I was there the last time in May of this year, didn't want anything to do with it. They wanted to be able to come to work, do their job, go home. They did not want, they were not familiar with, did not understand, and did not like the concept of a collective. And they found that in other societies too, and so that they're working on it. Can I guarantee that they won't stay with what they are or even go in the other direction? No, I don't know. I'm no expert on what Mondragon does, but they certainly recognize and debate it, and it's a hotly debated topic inside. About ecology. I understand that perfectly. It's one of the reasons I stress that if the workers themselves have to live with the technology that's being used and the products being made, they're going to make very different decisions about whether to take risks with their health and with the natural environment that they have to live on and depend on, and we'll get a much better set of decisions about ecology than the ones that we are living with now, and that's a step in the right direction. But even more, I want to address the good point made about production itself. In a capitalist system, we have a peculiar irony that we all kind of need to perhaps be reminded of. Every technological breakthrough in the last 400 years has been justified by its proponents on the grounds that if we just do this, the steam engine or telecommunication, we'll be able to live with so much less drudgery. We'll be relieved of the hard work and the drudgery of... And what's the reality? The reality is Americans work harder today than they ever have in our history. According to the OECD, Americans do more hours of paid labor per year than any other working class in any other country on this planet. We're the most technologically developed. It hasn't relieved the burden of labor. It's made it worse. Why? That's capitalism. Capitalism is not there to save us from work. It's there to make money. And money requires, if you understand Marxian theory, that value be produced by workers that the employer can take. And therefore, freeing workers from labor ain't gonna happen. You can see it in a particular way with unemployment. Think just simply like a child. If there's a need for 10% less workers to make something because the economy's lousy. We can't sell what we're producing. So 10% of our workers are making stuff we can't sell. We don't need 10% of the workers. Well, let's see now. There's two ways to go. One, we can say, okay, we need 10% less output. Everybody's going to do 10% less work, because that would be a way to share the burden of a problem that isn't any particular worker's fault. There isn't a desire for this. There isn't the income to buy these things. But that's not the fault of Harry as opposed to Louise, or vice versa. The alternative, our culture, our capitalist culture, the alternative is to say, okay, we need 10% less work done, so you 10%, you people, you get unemployed completely. Everybody else keeps working. The whole burden of this difficulty, which isn't your fault, is going to be dumped on your head. Why in the world would we do that? Here's the answer. If you impose unemployment on everybody equally has an incentive to fight against it. Whereas if you impose unemployment only on 10% of the people, the other 90% are grateful they didn't lose their job and don't become critics of this system. We handle unemployment that way. And now the ecology question. Suppose we decided ecologically that we are destroying our planet and we need to ratchet down our production, just the way the question was asked. Then we would make the decision. But we would have to make it in a way that was genuinely fair across the board. Everybody do 5% less work. Let's substitute 5% more leisure and 5% less production in order to handle this. If you did it that way, but that way isn't a capitalist way. And that way will be opposed by That's one of the reasons you need to make changes like this, so that these kinds of rational ways of dealing with economic change can be actually accomplished. Otherwise, we're back in the world that I, in my nastier moments, call the world of the New York Times and the Nation magazine. And that is a world in which we come up with wonderful ideas of what needs to be done, good ideas about what needs to be done, and then we throw them out there as if the problem was to get people to realize what a good idea it is, rather than to confront what the real obstacles are to these ideas, because it's the same obstacle that has been there since day one. It's why we have more technical advance than ever, and we're working ourselves to death as a society. That's because of this system that can't translate the very technology it achieves into the liberational mechanism that it defends these technologies with, but never implements, because they have to make money. That's the problem. If workers ran the enterprises themselves, they would have a whole new set of objectives. There's nothing sacrosanct about the bottom line. The bottom line can be the well-being of the people who work here. It can be the well-being of the community in which the facility, it doesn't have to be the profit. That's the lesson of all economics. And when people tell you otherwise, they're trying to get you to support the idea that what's best for them as directors and shareholders is what's best for everybody. But if you believe that, then you're the kind of person who thinks that if you only buy that kind of soap rather than that one, not only will you be clean in the shower, but your sex life will be transformed overnight. You laugh at that. You ought to laugh at the notion that profit is the royal road to social betterment. It never has been.
Fantastically to end. Thank you so much for this talk. Please go over there, get a book, get it signed, stop by the radical Bookfair for the weekend, come back in 5 minutes for the next talk, and thank you all for coming.
I do invite you to take a look at the book, where the arguments that we had to do briefly here are developed in greater strength. But whatever the book does or doesn't do for you, it is time for all of us to begin to move, because it's never been a better opportunity in the last half century than it is now.